Okay, welcome back, economists. We're here and we're moving forward with a really important idea for fiscal policy. That's our next topic on the guide here. Fiscal policy is pretty simple. It is government decisions that deal with taxation and government spending, right? So we're really thinking about the government's budget and the money that we have coming in and the money that we have going out of that budget. One of the factors that governments use to decide what they're going to do with their budget is the topic of this video, and that is called the Keynesian Multiplier. So obviously, John Maynard Keynes, he is the one, who's sort of this is named after. This idea is definitely in favor of the Keynesian idea that if there's a recession, that is not going to correct itself, and it is the government's responsibility to take action that will cause that recession to correct. And really the problem is when we have a recession is that there's not enough spending. There's a spending deficit, probably by a combination of groups of people in the economy, the most significant of which is the consumers. There's also a lack of spending by businesses and probably even a lack of spending by government as well. All of that is, of course, from the Keynesian view of things. So the Keynesian multiplier, it just sort of comes from the idea that we can understand from our circular flow diagram that once $1 is spent, it's not just spent once, right? That a dollar of spending by a consumer will be $1 in revenue for businesses, and businesses re-spend their revenue on factors of production, right? So if we have an increase in spending by $1, the increase in GDP will be greater than $1 because portions of that dollar will get re-spent, right? So the mathematical function of multiplying things, that's what we're going to do with this number, okay? So that's the Keynesian multiplier, that's what it is. But one of the things that limits the size of the Keynesian multiplier are three leakages of the circular flow. So if you recall from that diagram, we have three leakages: savings, taxes, and imports. Those are leakages because they stop money from being re-spent, right? Savings gets put in some kind of financial institution, taxes go into the government's budget, imports are spending on another country's goods and services with their origin of production being overseas, right? So that's money leaving the circular flow and going into another country's circular flow, okay? So one really important idea here with the Keynesian multiplier is called the marginal propensity to consume. You'll see it abbreviated, of course, as MPC. So the marginal propensity to consume is just simply the idea that it's sort of like the rate of consumer spending. So if 75% of a country's GDP is made up by consumer spending, right, that would be the marginal propensity to consume. That is how much of the GDP that consumers are spending. That's really important to understanding the Keynesian multiplier because the larger the marginal propensity to consume, right, the higher the rate or the incident of consumer spending, then the larger the Keynesian multiplier, okay? So you'll see this expressed a couple ways. This is ultimately the formula, but on an assessment, this is a very common topic for a paper 3. You might not be given the marginal propensity to consume, and you need to derive that from some other information that you have been given. So we can find out what the marginal propensity to consume is by figuring out first what our leakages are. Okay, so you could also do the Keynesian multiplier this way, or find the value of the Keynesian multiplier this way, and that you add up the MPS, the marginal propensity for savings, right? What percentage of household incomes get deposited in the bank? The marginal propensity for taxes, in other words, so what's a nation's average tax rate, right? If you added up all of taxes that the government collects in 1 year and you divided that by the GDP, you'd get the percentage of the GDP that government tax, or the average tax rate. Okay? And then the MPM, you might be wondering what that is. That is the marginal propensity for imports. That just simply means the rate of import spending. Okay? So what percentage of GDP gets spent on imports? You might also see it this way. If you were to add up all of the rates of leakage, you could do 1 over the marginal rate of leakage, and the MRL is just the same thing as all of these three things combined, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to find the value of our Keynesian multiplier in this one, and we are then going to multiply that by the amount of consumer spending, or sorry, we're going to maybe go with government spending, because we are talking about fiscal policy here. Let's say the government has a new spending project of $100 million, right? Government's decided that this economy is in a recessionary gap, as we have diagrammed here, right? We have a recessionary gap. The government has decided that it's not going to fix itself, and the government needs to try to stimulate some spending to get out of this recession, get people back to work, get them earning incomes. So remember from where we started, the Keynesian multiplier suggests that the government will spend $100 million. So we'll have an increase in government spending of $100 million. But our final increase in GDP will be greater than $100 million, because once the government spends $100 million, a portion of that $100 million will get respent multiple times as it makes its way around our circular flow model. Okay? So I'm going to give you some rates and some percentages here, and it should be fairly easy enough to make sense of what this idea of the marginal propensity to consume is, along with the marginal propensity for savings, taxes, and imports. Okay? So let's say an economy, nationally speaking, on average, of all of the household incomes that get earned in 1 year, let's say the savings rate is 10%. For every $1 that gets earned in wages or any other form of income, that 10 cents of that dollar gets saved and put in some kind of financial institution. I would say that's probably a pretty low savings rate, but we're going to use simple math for this example. So the next thing is a 25% tax rate. Of all of the economic activity that happens in a country, we're going to say that 25% of that gets taxed by the government. That's also probably pretty low. Most countries around the world have an average tax rate that's higher than 25%. And then finally, imports. Let's say 15% of all of the spending that happens goes towards imports. That's also pretty low. We live in a globalized world where most countries try to specialize in a narrow range of products that they're really good at making, and they just try to import the rest that they maybe aren't very efficient at making. So those are probably pretty low rates of leakages, but we're going to keep it simple for the purpose of trying to understand what this Keynesian multiplier idea is. So this information, we can derive the Keynesian multiplier using this, but we can't figure out what the marginal propensity to consume is. But if we add all of these up, right, a savings rate of 10%, a tax rate of 25%, and import spending of 15%, then all of this adds up to, obviously, 50% is basically our MRL, or our marginal rate of leakage. Okay, so in other words, with every dollar that gets spent, every dollar of economic activity, then that means that 50 cents of that will go towards our three leakages, which also means that 50 cents of that dollar stays within the circular flow and will get respent. Okay, so the math works out nicely here. Our MRL is 0.5, right? But that also means that if we were to plug this here, right, we would get a Keynesian multiplier of 2. But we can also figure out what the marginal propensity to consume is, and I kind of just said it actually. So if we assume that 50 cents of every dollar goes towards leakages, then we can know that 50 cents of that dollar stays in the circular flow and gets respent. So in this case, the MPC is also 50%. Obviously, that would not be the case if we played around with these rates of leakages here. I would encourage you, after this video is done, to play around with those and see how it affects the value of the multiplier. So we also have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.5. Now that we know this, we can figure out this, but we didn't necessarily have to figure out the value of the MPC. It will depend on the question, though. You could see a standalone question that says calculate the value of the marginal propensity to consume, or you could see a question that asks you to calculate the value of the Keynesian multiplier. So any which way, if we take our marginal rate of leakage, which is 1 divided by 0.5, even I can do that kind of calculation, that would be a Keynesian multiplier of 2. Okay, so that's the value of our multiplier is 2. So it's important to stop and think about, what did we just calculate, right? What does that value of the Keynesian multiplier mean? That means that for every increase in spending done by, in this example, government, or done by consumers, or even done by businesses, whatever the increase in spending, whatever the origin of that is, after all of the leakages go into place, and after that dollar circles around our circular flow of income model, the final increase in GDP will actually be $2, keeping in mind the idea that we started with, which is that $1 spent is also earnings for someone else, right? And that will lead to further increases of spending. So we're going to take this value of the Keynesian multiplier, which in this case is 2. Pretty simple here. We're going to multiply that by the value of our new spending bill from the government, which is $100 million. That's a pretty typical response to a recession or a deflationary gap. So after the government spends $100 million, and after the Keynesian multiplier takes effect, right, after that $100 million gets respent, and we've taken into account that 50% of that $100 million will go towards leakages. When it does get respent, we can know that the final increase in GDP, again, keeping the math simple here, is going to be $200 million. So from the government standpoint, they can spend $100 million and get an increase in GDP of $200 million. That is an argument for expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so the numbers here are pretty simple. I've kept the rates of leakages pretty low compared to what they might be in real life. Typically, countries save more than 10% a year, or at least I hope they do. Typically, it depends on the country, but most of the time, governments tax their citizens at a rate greater than 25%. And import spending is something that is becoming a lot more common these days. So a marginal rate of imports of only 15% is also probably pretty low. But I did that to, keep the math simple here. So the other half of this, now that we've thought about how to calculate all of this out and what the numbers mean, we need to think about how to graph this thing. So there's actually 2 events here that we need to diagram. So we're going to show 2 shifts. So by now we should have sorted out that all of what we just described up there is going to change aggregate demand, and it's going to increase it, right? So when the government spends $100 million on their new spending project, that will shift our aggregate demand curve by $100 million. But we know from the Keynesian multiplier that that's not the end of the story, right? Because a large portion of that $100 million will actually get respent by consumers and businesses, right? In order to spend that $100 million, the government would have to go out and buy raw materials from businesses. They'd have to go buy some capital. They'd have to hire some workers. And those businesses and those consumers, once they get that increase in income, they will go respend that money, right? So we're first going to show an increase in 100 million of aggregate demand, and this is totally made up by just the increase in government spending. So we're going to have one shift of aggregate demand here, so a shift from here to here. This distance here is 100 million. That's just simply the amount that the government spent. Okay? But now, like we just said, that's not the end of the line. All of that money that just got spent, that is now extra revenue for businesses and extra income for households, that will get respent. And when it does, we will have another increase in GDP. Just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to show that aggregate demand has increased to the full output level, even though that might not be very realistic. But for the sake of simplicity, right, hopefully this shows that as a result of the Keynesian multiplier, to show that accurately, we need to show that there are actually two shifts of aggregate demand. There's the initial increase of 100 million, which is the amount of the government spending project, and then when we do the Keynesian multiplier, right, that is the additional increase in spending by consumers and businesses that will result in another increase in aggregate demand. So this video actually addresses two different parts of the fiscal policy part of our guide. Number one, it shows you how to actually work out the Keynesian multiplier and how to do that math. But it also shows how the government can use expansionary fiscal policy, which is either a tax cut, right, a decrease in tax rates, or an increase in spending, but it's usually both. But in this case, they used an increase in government spending to try to close a recessionary gap, okay? So this video actually addresses two parts to what's important to know for our fiscal policy, right? So the Keynesian multiplier idea, it's pretty widely accepted by governments, right? Typically, when governments announce a new spending project, they'll announce that this is really going to be, a pretty positive thing in terms of trying to increase GDP, and that increase in government spending will not just be a one-off, that there will be further increases in overall spending from other participants in the economy who are not just working for the government. Okay, so the Keynesian multiplier, it's a pretty important thing. We've had lots of Keynesian thinking going on in the last year. As a result of the pandemic, governments have been doing lots of things to try to stimulate spending back to where it was prior to the pandemic. So it's a pretty important thing to know. You could see this on a paper 3. You could need to use it on a paper 1. Could also be relevant to what's going on with some internal assessments. Okay? Thanks, guys.